The 10 plagues of Egypt are a series of calamities described in the biblical book of Exodus, chapters 7 to 12. According to the narrative, these plagues were inflicted upon Egypt by God through the prophet Moses to secure the release of the Israelites from slavery. Each plague targeted a specific aspect of Egyptian life, ranging from the Nile turning to blood to the death of the firstborn. These events were not only catastrophic but also symbolic, challenging the authority of Egyptian gods and demonstrating the power of the Hebrew God over them. Within the context of the Bible, the plagues serve several purposes. Firstly, they display God's power and sovereignty, showcasing his ability to intervene in human affairs to fulfill his promises. Secondly, they demonstrate his judgment against Pharaoh and the Egyptians for their oppression of the Israelites, serving as a form of divine justice. In ancient Egyptian history, the plagues are not explicitly documented outside of the biblical narrative. However, some scholars have suggested possible natural explanations for some of the events, such as red algae blooms causing the Nile to turn red or volcanic activity triggering darkness. Nevertheless, these interpretations remain speculative and do not diminish the theological significance of the plagues. The interpretation of the plagues as divine justice or punishment has been a subject of debate among theologians and scholars. Some argue that the plagues were intended to punish the Egyptians for their mistreatment of the Israelites, highlighting God's righteousness and concern for justice. Others view the plagues as acts of mercy, designed to demonstrate God's power and convince Pharaoh to release the Israelites peacefully. Ultimately, the interpretation varies depending on one's theological perspective and understanding of the biblical text. The story of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt is one of the most iconic narratives in Judeo-Christian tradition, found primarily in the biblical book of Exodus. It recounts the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt and their eventual liberation under the leadership of Moses. According to the biblical account, the Israelites initially migrated to Egypt during a time of famine in the land of Canaan. They settled in the region of Goshen, where they multiplied and became a significant population over time. However, as the years passed, a new pharaoh rose to power who did not remember Joseph, the Israelite who had once held a position of influence in Egypt. This pharaoh began to fear the growing number of Israelites and saw them as a potential threat to his kingdom. In response to this perceived threat, the pharaoh subjected the Israelites to harsh slavery and oppression, forcing them to work as laborers in building projects and other menial tasks. They were treated as expendable resources rather than as fellow human beings. Despite their suffering, the Israelites continued to multiply, prompting Pharaoh to take even more extreme measures to control their population, including ordering the killing of all newborn Hebrew boys. It's within this context of oppression and suffering that Moses emerges as a central figure. Moses was born to Hebrew parents during a time when Pharaoh's decree to kill Hebrew male infants was in effect. In an act of desperation to save her son, Moses' mother placed him in a basket and set him adrift on the Nile River. Miraculously, Pharaoh's daughter discovered the baby and raised him as her own in the royal court. As Moses grew older, he became aware of his Hebrew heritage and witnessed the suffering of his people. One day, while he was in the wilderness, he encountered a burning bush that was not consumed by the flames. From this bush, God spoke to Moses, instructing him to return to Egypt and demand the release of the Israelites. Moses, initially reluctant and insecure about his abilities, eventually obeyed God's call and confronted Pharaoh, demanding that he let the Israelites go free. However, Pharaoh, hardened by his own pride and the power he held over the Israelites, refused to comply with Moses' demands. Instead, he escalated the oppression of the Israelites, making their labor even more grueling and unbearable. Moses and his brother Aaron performed various miracles and signs, such as turning water into blood and summoning plagues upon Egypt, as demonstrations of God's power and as warnings to Pharaoh. These plagues were meant to persuade Pharaoh to release the Israelites, but each time, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he refused to relent. The initial interactions between Moses, Pharaoh, and the demand for the release of the Israelites set the stage for a dramatic showdown between the power of God and the stubbornness of Pharaoh. The conflict between Moses and Pharaoh forms the core of the Exodus narrative, ultimately leading to the liberation of the Israelites and their journey to the Promised Land. Water turned to blood. Biblical account: Moses, at God's command, strikes the Nile, and its water turns into blood. All water sources in Egypt turn to blood, killing fish and making water undrinkable. Significance: this plague demonstrates God's power over nature and the impotence of Egyptian gods, especially Hapi, the god of the Nile. Symbolic meaning: it symbolizes the Egyptians' oppression of the Israelites, as they depended on the Nile for life. Blood may represent suffering and death. Interpretation: some see it as divine justice for the Egyptians' cruelty, while others view it as a punishment to awaken Pharaoh's conscience. Frogs. Biblical account: frogs overrun Egypt after Aaron stretches out his hand over the waters. Frogs invade homes, beds, and ovens. Significance: the plague highlights God's authority over creatures and the futility of the Egyptian gods, like Hecate, the frog goddess. Symbolic meaning: frogs were associated with fertility in ancient Egypt. Their proliferation symbolizes overwhelming and unstoppable affliction. Interpretation: it's seen as retribution for Pharaoh's refusal to free the Israelites. Some suggest it serves as a warning before harsher plagues. Gnats or lice. Biblical account: Aaron strikes the dust, and gnats or lice infest both people and animals in Egypt. Significance: this plague further humiliates the Egyptian magicians, who couldn't replicate it, showing God's superiority. Symbolic meaning: it could represent the degradation and defilement of Egypt due to its oppression of the Israelites. Interpretation: some view it as a means to assert the Israelites' identity, as they were spared from the plague. Others see it as a manifestation of God's judgment on Egypt's wickedness. Flies. Biblical account: swarms of flies descend on Egypt, except in Goshen, where the Israelites live. Significance: the plague intensifies the suffering of the Egyptians, contrasting with the protection of the Israelites. Symbolic meaning: flies symbolize filth and decay, suggesting the moral decay of Egypt under Pharaoh's rule. Interpretation: it's interpreted as a punishment for Pharaoh's stubbornness and refusal to release the Israelites. Livestock disease. Biblical account: all the livestock of the Egyptians die, while the livestock of the Israelites remain unharmed. Significance: this plague targets the livelihood and wealth of the Egyptians, demonstrating God's power over their resources. Symbolic meaning: livestock represented economic prosperity and security in ancient societies. Its destruction symbolizes the collapse of Egypt's economic foundation. Interpretation: it's seen as punishment for the Egyptians' involvement in the oppression of the Israelites. Some interpret it as a direct consequence of Pharaoh's refusal to let the Israelites go. Boils. Biblical account: Moses throws soot into the air, causing boils to break out on humans and animals throughout Egypt. Significance: the plague inflicts personal suffering on the Egyptians, affecting their health and well-being. Symbolic meaning: boils are often associated with disease and affliction. They may symbolize the physical and spiritual corruption resulting from Egypt's oppressive regime. Interpretation: it's considered a consequence of Pharaoh's stubbornness and refusal to acknowledge God's authority. Some interpret it as a manifestation of God's judgment on Egypt's cruelty. Hail. Biblical account: hail, accompanied by thunder and fire, strikes Egypt, destroying crops, trees, and livestock. Significance: this plague devastates Egypt's agricultural sector, further weakening its economy and infrastructure. Symbolic meaning: hail symbolizes destruction and divine judgment. Its selective targeting of Egypt's agriculture underscores God's control over nature. Interpretation: it's seen as a punishment for Pharaoh's continued resistance and refusal to release the Israelites. Some interpret it as a demonstration of God's sovereignty over Egypt's gods, including Nut, the sky goddess. Locusts. Biblical account: locusts swarm over Egypt, devouring any remaining vegetation after the hail. Significance: this plague exacerbates the famine caused by the hail, leaving Egypt in a state of desperation. Symbolic meaning: locusts symbolize destruction and chaos. Their consumption of crops reflects the devastation wrought by God's judgment. Interpretation: it's interpreted as a consequence of Pharaoh's obstinacy and refusal to heed God's warnings. Some see it as a demonstration of God's power over nature and Egypt's gods. Darkness. Biblical account: darkness covers the land of Egypt for 3 days, during which people could not see or move about. Significance: the darkness symbolizes spiritual blindness and the oppression of Egypt under Pharaoh's rule. Symbolic meaning: darkness represents chaos, evil, and the absence of God's presence and light. It highlights the contrast between the spiritual enlightenment of the Israelites and the spiritual darkness of Egypt. Interpretation: it's interpreted as a punishment for Pharaoh's refusal to acknowledge God's authority and release the Israelites. Some see it as a manifestation of God's judgment on Egypt's idolatry and oppression. Death of the firstborn. Biblical account: the final and most devastating plague, where God strikes down every firstborn in Egypt, from the Pharaoh's son to the firstborn of livestock. Significance: this plague brings about the ultimate deliverance of the Israelites from bondage and demonstrates God's power over life and death. Symbolic meaning: the death of the firstborn symbolizes the cost of Egypt's oppression and disobedience. It also foreshadows the sacrificial death of Christ for humanity's deliverance from sin. Interpretation: it's seen as divine justice for Pharaoh's cruelty and refusal to let the Israelites go. Some interpret it as a symbolic representation of the consequences of sin and the necessity of redemption. These plagues collectively serve as a dramatic demonstration of God's power, judgment, and mercy, ultimately leading to the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The 10 plagues of Egypt stand as a pivotal event within the Exodus narrative, symbolizing the power of divine intervention and liberation. Within the broader context of biblical theology, these plagues serve multiple purposes and carry profound significance. Firstly, the plagues demonstrate the sovereignty and power of God over both nature and human rulers. Each plague targets a specific aspect of Egyptian life, from the Nile turning to blood to the death of the firstborn, showcasing God's control over creation and the futility of human resistance against divine will. Secondly, the plagues serve as a judgment against the oppression and cruelty inflicted upon the Israelites by the Egyptians. By disrupting the normal order of life and inflicting hardship upon the oppressors, the plagues demonstrate God's commitment to justice and his solidarity with the oppressed. Thirdly, the plagues culminate in the liberation of the Israelites from bondage, marking the beginning of their journey towards the Promised Land. This event foreshadows the ultimate deliverance and salvation that God provides for his people throughout the biblical narrative. Finally, the narrative of the 10 plagues underscores the importance of faith and obedience in the face of adversity. Despite the suffering caused by the plagues, Pharaoh's stubbornness and refusal to acknowledge God's authority ultimately lead to his downfall. Conversely, Moses' trust in God and willingness to follow his instructions pave the way for the redemption of the Israelites. Overall, the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt serves as a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness, justice, and redemption throughout history. It invites readers to reflect on the nature of divine intervention, human responsibility, and the enduring struggle for freedom and righteousness. What are your thoughts on the significance of the 10 plagues within the Exodus story and biblical theology? Feel free to share your interpretations in the comments below. Thank you for joining me in exploring the significance of the 10 plagues of Egypt within the Exodus story and biblical theology. If you found this discussion insightful, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who might be interested, and subscribe to my channel for more thought-provoking content on various topics. I'd love to hear your thoughts and interpretations in the comments section below. Stay tuned for more engaging discussions and analysis. Until next time, take care.